Here in Lecture 5, we will begin on slide 39. In this lecture, we will cover chapters 3 and 4 of the book of Daniel. These two chapters are in some ways not as complicated as chapter 2 was with all of the various viewpoints, but on the other hand, these two chapters do play an important role in the larger picture of the book of Daniel. For one thing, in chapter 3, at the close of chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon will issue a decree that no criticisms would be allowed against the God of the three young men who were spared from the furnace of fire. This, in effect, means that the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar would have granted a religious permission for the religious observation of the Jews in Babylon. The second issue is that at the close of chapter 4, this same Nebuchadnezzar, after his downfall and restoration, would clearly recognize the God of the Hebrews and would issue a decree about that. He would say that he glorifies him as one whose dominion is eternal, whose kingdom endures from generation to generation, and all the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing in his sight. So this recognition of the God of the Hebrews is another important feature of not only chapter 4, but something that you will notice at various points in the book of Daniel, where pagans do recognize the supremacy of Israel's God. Slide 40. In chapter 3, there is the story of the image of gold in the fiery furnace, a story that's fairly familiar to probably most people who grew up listening to the stories in their Sunday school classes. Now, it's unclear from the biblical text whether the image of gold was a statue, such as a statue of a person, like Nebuchadnezzar himself, or was some sort of obelisk. We're not sure about that, but the gold probably suggests that this was a gold-plated image. At the height of 90 feet, gold would not have been a substantial enough metal out of which to construct the base for this image without it collapsing under its own weight. So most scholars would understand the gold here to be a gold veneer or gold plating of a statue. The underlying purpose of this image, of course, was the imperial order for worship and religious and political unity within the kingdom. This was the idea. So Nebuchadnezzar made this imposing image 90 feet high, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. In a flat country like Babylon, this image no doubt could have been seen from a very great distance. And so everyone was to bow and to give obeisance before this image whenever they heard the music playing. And whoever did not fall down and worship would immediately be thrown into a burning furnace of fire. So the three young men are described in this chapter as not bowing down to this image. Now, we don't know where Daniel was at this time. Daniel is not mentioned in this chapter. Theoretically, because he was now in administrative service, perhaps he was out of the city for a time or was somewhere else on some other kind of business. But that's just simply an area of speculation, and there's no way for us to know for sure. Slide 41. It is of interest to note that at 90 feet high, this statue or this image was not the largest in the ancient world. The largest in the ancient world was the Colossus at Rhodes, which was completed in about 280 BC in commemoration of a successful defense of the city of Rhodes, and it stood somewhat higher than this image of Nebuchadnezzar. According to ancient descriptions, the Colossus at Rhodes stood 107 feet high. In modern times, the statue that is probably most similar would be the American Statue of Liberty in New York City, which in fact was patterned after the Colossus at Rhodes in the ancient world. The Statue of Liberty stands at 151 feet high, and that does not count the pedestal. So by comparative standards, you can sort of imagine the height of this image and how it could have been seen in the ancient world. Slide 42. Of course, since the three young men refused to bow down to the image, they were eventually cast into a furnace of fire. But as Nebuchadnezzar peeked through probably a stoke hole into this furnace, he discovered that not only were these three men in the fire, but alive, unbound, and walking around, but there was a fourth person in the fire that looks like a son of the gods, which is the expression that Nebuchadnezzar uses. Now, older English versions translated Daniel 3 and verse 25 as the fourth is like the Son of God. This would be the rendering in the King James Version. And this in turn led to a fairly common belief that the fourth figure in the fire was a pre-incarnation of Christ. Well, whether or not that is true, the fourth figure certainly was a supernatural figure. We don't know whether it was an angel or Christ himself, but at least it seems unlikely that Nebuchadnezzar, who was a pagan king, would have recognized him as Christ. He would have had no frame of reference for such an identity. And so the translation that the fourth is like the Son of God is perhaps more specific than is appropriate. Later English versions will render this as a son of the gods or a supernatural figure. And in fact, you'll find that true of virtually all modern translations, and only the New King James Version retains the older rendering, that it was like this, the Son of God. But it adds a footnote even there and says a son of the gods. And in fact, in the Aramaic, which is the original text here, the word gods is a plural. So that is an appropriate translation. Slide 43. However you look at chapter 3, whether you take a Maccabean view of it or a messianic or dispensational view of this chapter, will really affect the way that you understand its meaning in the larger framework of Daniel. If you adopt one of the traditional and more conservative interpretations, which be the messianic or the dispensational view, then this story in chapter 3 should be taken as a straightforward historical account. It's something that actually happened in the 6th century BC. And in fact, this is the way that I am taking this passage in this present set of lectures. However, if one adopts the Maccabean viewpoint that the book of Daniel really relates to the mid-2nd century BC and the struggle of the Jews against the Syrian Greeks, then the story in chapter 3 would be relevant in the context of the oppressions of Antiochus Epiphanes. I've offered on slide 43 just a short passage from 2 Maccabees 10, which says that as the dawn was breaking, the two armies joined battle. This would be the army of the people of Israel and the army of the Syrian Greeks. The one having as pledge of success and victory not only their valor, but their reliance upon the Lord, that of course would be the Jews, while the other made rage their leader in the fight, and that would be the armies of Antiochus Epiphanes. When the battle became fierce, there appeared to the enemy from heaven 5 resplendent men on horses with golden bridles. They were leading the Jews. Surrounding Maccabeus and protecting him with their own armor and weapons, they kept him from being wounded, and they showered arrows and thunderbolts upon the enemy. Now, this description in 2 Maccabees of a supernatural intervention in behalf of the armies of Judas Maccabeus is similar, at least, in its basic outlines to the protection of the 3 men in the fire. And so those who take this chapter as being representative of a Maccabean framework would then say that it simply is an encouragement to the Jews to trust that they will be given supernatural help from heaven in their struggle against the Syrian Greeks. Now, in chapter 3, there is going to be the first of the additions to Daniel. On slide 44, I have listed the 4 additions to the book of Daniel that appear in the apocrypha. One of them is the prayer of Azariah. The second is the song of the 3 young men, and these appear both in connection with the story in chapter 3. The Septuagint, of course, will have these, and you will also, of course, find them in any Roman Catholic Bible. The prayer of Azariah is basically the prayer that one of the 3 young men offered while he was in the furnace of fire. And the song of the 3 young men is a description of their song of victory as they are delivered from the fire. The other 2 stories will come at the end of the book of Daniel, but these 4 additions have been accepted as canonical by Eastern Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholic Christians, but they are not canonical for Protestants or Jews. And so keep that in mind as you look at this chapter. If you don't have a copy of these editions, you can find them either in a Revised Standard Version with the apocrypha, or one of the Roman Catholic Bibles, such as the New American Bible or the Jerusalem Bible, or even the older Ramsdewey version of the Bible. Slide 45. Here's just a brief summary of the additions to Daniel, the Prayer of Azariah, the Song of the Three Young Men. Slide 46. For the next several slides, I want to show you what we know of ancient Babylon, the Babylon of the time of Nebuchadnezzar II. This slide, slide 46, shows a foundation cylinder, such as was buried in the corner of larger buildings. And since chapter 4 of Daniel is primarily concerned with Nebuchadnezzar's building projects, and of course his pride over his building projects, I want to show you some of the things that we know about the Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar constructed. This particular cylinder describes 3 of the palaces that Nebuchadnezzar built. Slide 47. This is a map of the ancient city of Babylon, and you will see, if you look carefully, that the Euphrates River runs right through the city, a bit to the left side of what is depicted here. There is a new town to the left of the Euphrates and the old town to the right of the Euphrates. And then there's quite a number of temple structures, the processional way, various other kinds of things that you see within the city walls. Now, there's more than one wall. There's an outer wall, and there is an inner wall. And these all figure in the way that Nebuchadnezzar constructed and to some degree reconstructed the city of Babylon. Slide 48 is a map of the Ishtar Gate, which is the gate at the end of the processional way. This is a very elaborate gate, which I'm going to show you in various portions of what have been excavated over the last century or so by various archaeological expeditions. Slide 49 shows a reconstruction of the processional way that is in Berlin, Germany. In the museum there, the various ceramic tiles that were part of the decoration of the processional way can here be clearly seen. Now, this is not quite as wide as the actual processional way in Babylon, and it's not nearly as long, because in Babylon this was 250 meters long. This is a very, very long processional way. But it does have, in fact, the porcelain tiles that have been excavated from the processional way in Babylon. This processional way is approximately 20 to 24 meters wide. It had a central traffic lane. Chariots could pass each other, and it also had pedestrian walkways. If you should ever be privileged to go to Berlin, you want to be sure and go to the Pergamon Museum where you can see this in person. Slide 50 shows one of the lion friezes from the processional way. As a person comes into Babylon toward the court of the king, the lions will be depicted with their tails up. When one leaves the presence of the king, then the lions are depicted with their tails down. This particular one, of course, has his tail down. But you can see how colorful these porcelain tiles are. And in fact, they would have been even more vivid in the ancient world, because the primary color of the lions was red, and over the centuries that has faded to kind of a tan or a brown. But it would have been very, very brilliant to the young Hebrews as they walked down the processional way in their first visit to Babylon. Slide 51 is a reconstruction of the gate itself, and this also is in the museum, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Slide 52 shows larger depictions of the bull of Adad and the dragon of Marduk, which were deities of Babylon represented by composite figures. And slide 53, which is part of the Ishtar Gate that was excavated and now resides in the Detroit Institute of Arts in Michigan in the United States, shows you the dragon of Marduk. This particular image is helpful for us, especially when we get to chapter 7, because it shows a composite image, which was part of the iconography of the ancient world. The head of a serpent, horns of perhaps a ram, the front feet of a lion, the back feet of an eagle, the body with scales, and the tail like a snake. Slide 54 shows the bull of Adad, which again is a depiction of one of the deities. And slide 55 shows an aerial view of the Esagila Temple Tower, which after all of these centuries, of course, is in ruins, but this has been partially excavated, and we have a pretty fair idea of what it looked like in the ancient world. So if you look at slide 56, you will see a small model of the ziggurat that once was part of the worship of Marduk in the city of Babylon. And this is considered to be a pretty accurate model of what the temple must have looked like, a stepped pyramid. Finally, there is some inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar. You can see the blow-up. This, of course, is not in a language that we read today, other than very specialists may be able to read it. But it does show you the elaborate nature of the palaces that Nebuchadnezzar built. Slide 58 shows a small cuneiform inscription, also in Berlin, which describes the city of Babylon as a city of festivity and joy and dance, a city that's very commercial, a city of goods, that sort of thing. So when we get to the city of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar's pride over Babylon, you have some fair idea of the kind of things that Nebuchadnezzar built. Slide 59 shows one of the excavation pictures of them unearthing portions of the wall in the Ishtar Gate. And slide 60 is somewhat of an aerial view, also showing the excavation of the elaborate gate. Slide 61 shows a model of the gate built by the artists of an archaeological team. So as you can see, Babylon was a very elaborate city, and when the Hebrews came to Babylon, this must have been quite an amazing city. Slide 62, I've mentioned the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. We actually have no archaeological remains of the gardens, but we do know that they existed, and they are described by several writers from the ancient world, including Berosus as early as the 3rd century BC. Now, in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in which he is terrified. He is deeply disturbed by this dream. He brings in his magicians, his enchanters, all of the astrologers and so on, and asks them to give him the meaning of the dream. While he was in bed, he saw this large tree in the middle of the land, and the top touched the sky. And then the tree was cut down, the branches were trimmed, and then the stump and its roots were bound with iron and bronze, and then it was drenched with the dew of heaven. And he had no idea what this could possibly mean. But Daniel was instrumental in interpreting it for Nebuchadnezzar, just as he had interpreted the dream in chapter 2. The stump bound with bronze indicated that Nebuchadnezzar's life would not end, but nonetheless, he was the tree that would be cut down, and he would experience some sort of terrible, debilitating experience. Daniel's concluding advice was that the king needed to repent. He needed to change his ways. He needed to avoid being lifted up in pride. But in fact, within the year, Nebuchadnezzar himself was standing and looking over all of Babylon that he had built, and all of the structures and the temples and the walls. And in his pride, he claimed all of this to his own credit. And because he did so, words came from heaven that demoted him and reduced him to some sort of terrible schizophrenic condition. Slide 64 is just a summary of some of the things that Nebuchadnezzar built, which we have looked at in pictures. Slide 65. We don't know very much about Nebuchadnezzar's last years. There's no information from antiquity that would assist us with a lot of details about this derangement. Usually, his malady is described as some form of lycanthropy, which is a schizophrenic condition in which a human assumes that he or she's been transformed into an animal, or particularly into a wolf, and behaves accordingly. This seems to have happened to Nebuchadnezzar. All of this, in verse 28, says happened to the king. As the king was walking on the roof and was remarking to himself how great Babylon was that he had built, then he, while the words were still on his lips, a voice from heaven said, "This is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge the Most High as sovereign over the kingdoms of the world." And immediately what had been spoken from heaven was fulfilled. According to the biblical text, Nebuchadnezzar was driven away. He began to eat grass like an animal. His body was drenched with dew, which probably means that he stayed outside. He lived out in away from civilization. His hair grew until it was almost like feathers of an eagle, and his nails like claws. But finally, at the end of the 7 times, Nebuchadnezzar raised his eyes toward heaven, and he praised Yahweh, the God of heaven, and said that his dominion is an eternal dominion. And when he recognized the God of heaven, his sanity was restored. Now, this seems to presume that the mental condition of Nebuchadnezzar was largely something in his mind. It's not so much that he actually turned into an animal, but that he thought of himself as an animal. We have nothing, therefore, in the records of antiquity that tell us anything about this period of Nebuchadnezzar. Certainly not this story. But we actually have a dearth of information in the latter years of Nebuchadnezzar's life. So there's really not much to go on in trying to find some sort of historical cross-reference for this condition. But the biblical record itself is clear enough as to what happened. Slide 66. Now, if you adopt one of the more conservative views of the book of Daniel, the story in chapter 3 would have a very important message to the Jews in the midst of exile. One of the problems, of course, of the Jews coming into exile, and of course Daniel and the 3 young men are kind of the first down payment of exiles that would come to Babylon. But one of the problems is that when they came to Babylon, they would meet the Babylonian gods, the Babylonian culture, the Babylonian city of extravagance, and the story that would be told them is that the reason Jerusalem fell and the reason that the people of Israel are in exile is because the God of Babylon is bigger than the God of Jerusalem. Marduk is more powerful than Yahweh. So it was important for the Jews in exile to realize that the God who allowed them to go into exile did not allow them to go into exile because of his weakness. Rather, he allowed them to go into exile as a judgment for their disobedience and their breaking of covenant. God, Yahweh, was still the king of the world, and all rulers of the world, pagan or otherwise, still were under his control. And so in this story of chapter 4 then, and in fact that would be true also of the story in chapter 3, it becomes very apparent that even though Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful king in the ancient world, he is still under the authority of God himself. Yahweh God, the God of the Israelites, is still the king of the universe. And he controls, he puts up kings, he takes down kings as he determines by his sovereign will. On the other hand, if you read chapter 4 in the context of the middle of the 2nd century BC, which is the Maccabean viewpoint, then this story is a parable to encourage the Jews who are opposing Antiochus Epiphanes. And here, in some ways, I suppose the message would be similar to the previous one, but here the power of the Syrian Greek king could not stand up to the power of Yahweh. And so those who read this in a Maccabean viewpoint generally do not take this as literal history. Generally, they take this as more parabolic. It is a story that is encouraging to the Jews who are facing Antiochus Epiphanes. And as I said before, I am following the line that this is, in fact, a historical account, that this actually happened to Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BC. But at least you understand the difference of the views and how they will interpret this passage in the book of Daniel. That brings us to the end of lecture number 5. I've only gone through the archaeological slides very briefly, but I thought it was important that you realize that they do exist, and perhaps if it is ever within the range of your experience and you are able to go to Berlin, you will be able to see much of this firsthand. Berlin has quite arguably the best collection of Babylonian artifacts, things from ancient Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's period that exist now in the modern world.